There are killers who run. They disappear into the night. They cross state lines. They change their names, dye their hair, and start over somewhere nobody knows their face. They spend years looking over their shoulder, waiting for the moment the past catches up with them. And then there are killers who stay, who call the police themselves, who stand in their own doorway and hold it open for investigators, who sit across the table from detectives and answer every question with the steady, unhurried confidence of someone who believes, completely and without doubt, that they will never be held accountable for what they have done. John Battaglia was one of those people. On the evening of May 2, 2001, John Battaglia called his ex-wife Mary Jean Pearl from his apartment in Dallas, Texas. He did not call to apologize. He did not call to negotiate. He did not call because he was frightened or desperate or looking for a way out. He called and told her to listen. And then he shot their two daughters, Faith, aged 9, and Liberty, aged 6, while their mother listened on the other end of the phone, screaming their names into the receiver. When it was over, he hung up. He left his apartment. He got a tattoo. He went to a bar. He called friends. He acted, in every observable way, like a man who had just had a perfectly ordinary Wednesday evening in Dallas. And when police arrived at his apartment later that night, John Battaglia opened the door himself and let them in. This is the story of one of the most cold-blooded acts in the history of Texas crime. A story about a man who believed the rules of civilized society simply did not apply to him. A story about a system that had every opportunity, multiple opportunities, over multiple years, to protect two little girls. And failed them completely. John Battaglia was born in 1955 in Texas. He built a career as an accountant. He was professionally capable and socially functional in ways that allowed him to move through the world without raising obvious alarm. He had friends. He had colleagues. He had a life that, from the outside, appeared unremarkable. But John Battaglia had a history of violence that stretched back long before the night he killed his daughters. He had been convicted of assaulting a former girlfriend years earlier. He had restraining orders filed against him. Multiple women who had been in relationships with him had experienced his explosive rage firsthand. He was not a man who had simply snapped under unusual pressure. He was a man with a long, documented pattern of threatening and violent behavior toward the women in his life. His marriage to Mary Jean Pearl had been volatile from the very beginning. She had seen his anger up close. She had experienced what he was capable of. She had tried, through the courts and through the legal system, to build a barrier between herself, her daughters, and the man she had married. She had obtained a protective order against him. That protective order was in place and legally active on the evening of May 2, 2001. John Battaglia was required by law to have only supervised contact with his daughters. He was not supposed to be alone with them. But earlier that day, through a combination of scheduling failures, administrative miscommunication, and a system that was not moving quickly enough to enforce its own orders, John Battaglia had picked up Faith and Liberty for what should have been a supervised visit. It was not supervised. Nobody checked. Nobody followed up. Nobody made sure that the man with a history of violence and an active protective order against him was actually being monitored while he had access to his children. He took them to his apartment. He made them dinner. And then, at some point during that evening, he picked up his phone and called their mother. The call lasted long enough for Mary Jean to understand what was happening. Long enough to hear her daughter's voices in the background. Long enough to hear the shots. Long enough to hear the silence that followed. She called 911 immediately. She was barely coherent. She told the operator what she had heard. She gave the address. She begged them to hurry. Officers arrived at Battaglia's apartment within minutes. He opened the door himself. He did not attempt to flee. He did not deny what had happened. He did not appear distressed in any way that suggested remorse or panic or the emotional aftermath of a man who had lost control of himself. He was calm. He was present. He let them in. Faith and Liberty were found inside the apartment. Both had been shot multiple times at close range. Faith was 9 years old. Liberty was 6. John Battaglia was arrested at the scene. In the days that followed, the full picture of what had happened began to emerge. Investigators pieced together the timeline of that evening. The dinner. The phone call. The shooting. The tattoo parlor, where Battaglia had gone afterwards and sat in a chair and had ink pressed into his skin like a man with no weight on his conscience whatsoever. The bar, where he had drunk and spoken to people around him without any visible sign of distress. The behavior was, to everyone who encountered it, deeply disturbing. Not because it suggested madness, but because it suggested the opposite. At his trial, prosecutors built a case around the overwhelming direct evidence. The phone call, which had been partially recorded. The physical evidence recovered from inside the apartment. The timeline of his movements that evening. The witnesses who had seen him before and after the murders. But what stayed with jurors, what stayed with everyone who sat in that courtroom, was not the evidence itself. It was John Battaglia. He was cold. He was controlled. He made no attempt to appear remorseful. He did not offer an explanation that suggested a man overwhelmed by emotion or pushed beyond his limits by extraordinary circumstances. Prosecutors argued that he had killed Faith and Liberty because he was consumed by rage toward their mother. That he had used his own daughters, the two people in the world he was supposed to love and protect above everything else, as instruments of revenge. As a way of causing Mary Jean Pearl the maximum possible pain. He had called her so she would hear it happen. He had wanted her to know. He had wanted her to carry the sound of it for the rest of her life. John Battaglia was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For 16 years, he remained on death row in Texas, filing appeals and challenging his conviction through every available legal mechanism. His legal team raised questions about his mental competency, about procedural matters in the original trial, about the reliability of specific pieces of evidence. Every appeal was rejected. On February 1, 2018, John Battaglia was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was 62 years old. He declined to make a final statement. Mary Jean Pearl has spoken publicly in the years since about what it means to live with the phone call she received that night, about the sound she cannot unhear, about raising her other children in the shadow of what happened, about the protective order that existed on paper and failed in practice. She has become one of the most vocal advocates in Texas for the stronger enforcement of protective orders, for a legal system that takes the documented history of violent men seriously before it is too late. For the women and children who are still living, right now, under the same threat her daughters lived under. Faith Battaglia was 9 years old. Liberty Battaglia was 6. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply been born to a father who did not see them as people deserving of love and protection, but as objects in a war against their mother. The system knew about John Battaglia. It had records of his violence. It had issued a protective order. It had mandated supervised visitation. And it had still, through failure and oversight and the gaps that exist in every system designed by imperfect people, allowed him to be alone with his daughters on the last evening of their lives. Their names were Faith and Liberty. They deserved exactly what those names promised them. They received neither. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the Yard Files. Every day we bring you real stories, real cases, and real questions that demand answers. Because some stories are too important to forget. Until next time, stay safe. And never stop asking questions.